So we have a couple of images, Creative Commons images of the Texas A&M girls volleyball team. So here's a couple of girls that look, their heads are about the same size, but they look very different. So we're going to do a morph between them. And the most important thing when starting and doing a morph, whether it's a still or a motion, is that you need to line up the images the best you can before you even do the morph, because then that way it'll keep the features from seeming like they're sliding around on the people's faces. So to do that, I'm going to drop down, I'm going to pull down wipe mode for the viewer and put one on one side and one on the other. And what's great about this is you can also do a cross dissolve. So I'm going to cross dissolve here and use this transformer that I already have set up to get the girls' heads lined up the best I can. And really what you want to line up are things like the eyes and the top of the jaw, the teeth, that kind of stuff, the nose, parts that indicate the shape of the skull. Because if the shape of the skull changes too much, that's really more disconcerting, and it makes the makes things seem like they're sliding around more. So you really want to try to line things up the best you can just starting. So I think that's probably about the best that we're gonna, oops, grabbed the wrong jack. That's probably about the best that we're gonna be able to do here, but that's pretty good. So now we have them lined up pretty well. If you're doing it on a moving footage, not only would you need to essentially rotoscope the source and destination shapes for both, but you'd want to also make sure that you got the video lined up. So you would do an edit similar to this on the moving footage to get things lined up the best you could for the frames that you were going to do the morph over. Okay, so let's get the spline warp in here. We're going to go from this girl to this girl, and we're only going to morph the face. We're not going to morph the hair. We're going to keep this girl's hair and her uniform and everything else. And in a movie, the way that this would work is you'd just do that on one shot, unless you had to change the hair for the shot, but you'd just do it on one shot, and then you'd cut away, and then you'd cut back, and then it would be the other actor in the wardrobe for the morph that they had to do. So let's do this. SplineWarp, drop down to SplineWarp, A to B. And we'll start by drawing the shapes we need on the A side. So we need to get her. We know we need to get her eyes, her eyebrows, her nose, her mouth, and the rough shape of her head. And we'll start with that and we'll refine from there. So I'll start drawing. Let's start with her eyes. Okay, so I've created the basic shapes for her eyes, her nose, and her mouth. Let's do some open shapes for her eyebrows now. That's something that might not be clear, is that you can actually do open shapes as well. I create a new open shape. And just by dropping the tool, it will leave it as an open shape. So let's name these. Okay, now we got all of the basic shapes for her face. Let's create a boundary shape while we're here, just to keep things simple. So I'm going to create a basic boundary shape, because we don't need much for this shot. Hit enter to close it. And this will be our boundary shape to constrain this warp or morph to just the face area. We're not even going to worry about the neck for this shot too much. And then to make this into a boundary shape, while the shape is selected, we can just click here, and that will turn it into a boundary shape. Okay, so we have all of our shapes for our A side, but how are we going to get shapes into our B side? See, right now we're looking at A warped. We could look at it unwarped, but there's no warping happening yet. But if we look at B, you'll see it has no shapes. Well, similar to what we did when we were only warping an image, we can connect these to the B using the menu, the context menu. So I'm going to right click here and say duplicate to B and join. So this will create a duplicate of this shape into B, and it will join it to this shape. So I'm just going to work my way around the whole thing. Now let's look at B, and you'll see that B has all of these shapes here. So I can start editing right in B. So that these points correspond to where they correspond in A, or what the points that they are in at A. So I want to make sure that I align these things up to be about the same place as they were in the other side. Okay, that's a good starting place. Let's get rid of this boundary. And I'm going to use a shape around the face to warp the face into the right overall shape. And we may use the boundary to control the hair. So go right along the hairline here. And we will take this shape and duplicate in B and join. And jump over to B. And we'll just gently adjust this to hopefully capture the overall silhouette of this girl's face. Okay, so now we can see that our correspondence points are not really great in all of the shapes. So let's edit these. I'm going to edit the correspondence. If we go to this A/B mode here, we can see them both at the same time. And we really want these to interpolate along the straightest line possible, typically. That will create the most convincing result in the final morph. Now, if we want to see how much what we're seeing, if we're seeing the A or the B, right now we're looking at both. We're actually looking at A warped. And if we want to cross dissolve across, this slider here will show us whether we're seeing A or B. So since we are viewing the warped version, fully warped version, this will control for warping from A to B. And this will control if we're looking at A or B. So this is how we can check our work as we go. And we can see that our teeth aren't lining up so well. So I'm going to cross dissolve between the two. And I'm actually going to use the teeth as a landmark as I edit the shapes here. So I'm going to primarily focus on the B shape, which is blue. That's a mnemonic you can use. Try to get the teeth to line up a little bit better. So unfortunately, they have very, very different noses, which is going to create a little difficulty here. If you wanted to make it seem like this corners of the nose were rising up, you could use the correspondence point here to animate that effect a little bit. Okay, so let's look at A, and we're going to warp A across here. It's a very subtle move, but there we go. And before we continue, let's fix up this eye because it's not distorting well. So right now I'm looking at the A. So this is the fully warped A, and we would rarely actually see it this distorted. We will have cross dissolved to the other one before we would see it like this, but it's still disturbing that the eye is getting so distorted. So let's adjust the correspondence points a little bit more on here to hopefully make this eye not distort quite so much. There we go. And that looks pretty good. So let's create a hard boundary to contain this warp to just the face area. So I'm going to create a hard boundary way out here. And again, we'll keep it simple. No more points than we really need. Oops, editing the wrong thing. So right now it created this shape as both an A and B shape because I'm in the A-B mode. So I'm going to undo this shape and just go back to A only unwarped, and that's where I will create my shape. Since we intend to use this as a hard boundary, not as an A and B shape. So Nuke will actually guess what you're trying to do. If you draw when you're in that A and B mode, it will infer that you mean to create both A and B shapes simultaneously. So that's yet another way that you can create both the shapes at the same time. And the correspondence will be perfect, of course, because they respond from the same shape. So we will call this boundary. And we will toggle on its boundary mode. So this will now become the hard boundary around the whole face. So let's go back to AB mode where we can see the warp, and we can see it's not changing their hair any. And we will hide the overlays by hitting Q. And we will animate the root warp. So that's the first girl's face warping into something like the shape of the second girl's face. And now to finish the effect, we need to create some animation. So I will go back to the first frame, and we will create a keyframe for the mix amount here. Move forward a little bit, give it a little bit of time. And we will now start to warp over the duration of a few frames. The other interesting thing about morphs is in order for them to look convincing, you have to make them happen fast enough. You can actually do these by shape if you have layers. Right now we don't have too many layers, so let's do an overall morph first, and we'll see how it works. But if needed, you could do these by layer as well, layer warp. So you can warp different sections at different paces. So let's keep going. We'll create a keyframe here where we do our warp. But then before we get fully warped, about halfway through, we're going to start to cross dissolve in the other one. There we go. Now, the whole thing is cross-dissolving in, unfortunately, but including the hair. But we can fix that because we can just matte in the other side. Now we can see that we didn't quite get the lips right, and this is another reason why looking at it is kind of a good way to go. We can get the lips to line up a little bit better during this morph. There we go. So let's just cut out this head section that we're morphing and composite it over the second girl. And I'll be right back. I'm going to pause. So I just duplicated the shape of the boundary shape into another roto shape that we can use in a key mix to bring this warp back over, this morph back over this girl's face here. So take a key mix and put this over that, and hopefully this will work. Let's see. Soften that up a little bit. So this is a very simple approach that would work for a still like this. Obviously, it would not work if it was moving. And now the morph will only be the face there. So make a flip book really quick. There we go. And obviously with continued improvement, a little bit more refinement of getting the shapes just right on the eyes and getting the teeth to line up a little bit better, this could be made to look a little bit better. You get the point. It's all about just getting the features to line up so that when this cross dissolve happens, it's not obviously just a simple cross dissolve. Like, for example, we might create another shape for these irises because they don't line up. So we would make a shape for the iris and we would slide the iris over. The eyebrows are working really well. The nose needs a little bit more work, but of the broad strokes, this is the recipe to make it work. So there you go. Morphing using the SplineWarp node.